Oh, you guys are way more energetic than that. Good morning. Good morning. Thank you. I've been watching you for the last hour. You've got much more energy. Welcome to Quinnipiac University. My name is Carrie Bulger. I am the chair of the Department of Psychology, and you're not here to hear me talk. I have nothing to do with neuroscience except chairing the department in which it's housed. So I'm going to talk for a very brief time. But mostly what I wanted to say is thank you so much for coming. I'm glad you could join us on this really beautiful day. Aren't you glad the conference wasn't last weekend? Me too. Although we did have power here, so maybe you would have been grateful to come here and have heat and someplace to charge your phone. At any rate, we couldn't be more delighted to host Neuron for the second year in a row. This is the 21st conference of Neuron. Neuroscience has been at Quinnipiac for many, many years, but like the rest of the university, this field is undergoing a period of substantial growth. So we are delighted to have you here to share your research, to talk about the scholarship of neuroscience, and new this year to talk about the art of science. What you're doing here today is a part of our ongoing conversation about how to bring this field more into being at Quinnipiac, and it's also a part of the mission of the College of Arts and Sciences, which is Creative Minds in Action, and that's what you're doing here today. So like I said, I'm not going to talk very long. That's all I want to say. Please enjoy our beautiful setting, enjoy yourselves today, and have a great conference.
Good morning. My name is Cheryl Fry. I'm a faculty member at the University of Albany, and I'm one of the founding members of Neuron. And I have to say what a great pleasure it is to... Okay, thanks. Let's see. Down here. I'll try to speak louder. It's a great pleasure to be here today and to see all of these bright, shiny faces interested in neuroscience. It's a wonderful accomplishment, and it's a special pleasure for me to be able to introduce my colleague, Dr. Cheryl McCormick. It's very special for me to have this opportunity to introduce her because we've been colleagues and friends for a number of years. Currently, Dr. McCormick is a Canadian Research Chair in Neuroscience at Brock University. Her research interests are in developmental neuroendocrinology, and she studies stress responses in adolescents, primarily using a rodent model. That's not what she's going to be talking about today, though. She's going to be talking about a fun, real fun sideline of research. But I'm going to tell you a little bit about Dr. McCormick and her background. She got her PhD. So I have these two bits of information up here because they kind of illustrate the breadth of Dr. McCormick's training. Her undergraduate degree was doing work in rodent models, and that was at McGill University. And then her doctoral work was using a neuropsychological approach and looking at differences in differences in sexual orientation. So she's got a considerable breadth of training and experience. As we discussed, her current position is in the Psychology and Neuroscience program at Brock University. I came to know Dr. McCormick initially when we were both on the faculty at Bates College. After getting my PhD, I did a one-year visiting sabbatical replacement position at Bates College, and that was the same year that Dr. McCormick started a tenure-track position there. And she's had a variety of experiences. She is a recipient of many awards, as is seen here. This is kind of a cool slide that shows how connected and illustrious Dr. McCormick is with her academic family genealogy, having her connected with Spencer, Lashley, etc. Ignore the people behind the curtains. And she's written a few papers, and a few more, and a few more. and they've been very well cited. So we are lucky to have with us such a great scholar. But as I said, it's really a treat for me to be able to introduce Dr. McCormick because she's played a very special role for Neuron. And as we were both junior faculty members together, Dr. McCormick and I and another colleague, a more senior colleague, Priscilla Kehoe at Trinity College, worked together to form this conference. And in fact, Dr. McCormick came up with the name Neuron. This is one of her real substantive contributions. Actually, Priscilla, well, it was kind of a funny thing. So I think Priscilla was with us. Yeah, we were down in an International Behavioral Neuroscience Conference down in Cancun, Mexico. And we were, in the stages of planning about this meeting and getting things together and all of this. And Dr. McCormick was a bit indisposed.
Montezuma's revenge.
Well, yes, Dr. McCormick was a bit indisposed, and Dr. Kehoe and I had gone off to Tulum or something like this. And we had been checking on her before, we come back afterwards, and she's in a little bit of a febrile state, glassy eyes, and all. She's like, we come back and she's like, I've got it. We're gonna call the conference Neuron. And trilled off the acronym for us. So thank you, Cheryl. It's quite a blessing. That's really made the meeting. I can't tell you how many people have said, how clever that is. And that's Dr. McCormick's cleverness. I think that illustrates our wonderful keynote speaker here. So I don't want to speak anymore because I know that you guys all want to hear what she has to say. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you.
Can you guys help me
Well, thanks, Cheryl, for that great introduction. And yes, it was Montezuma's revenge. So it really is a treat for me to be here at Neuron again, because once I left Bates College and went back to Canada to Brock University in 2004, I haven't been able to attend as often. So it is a real pleasure to see how it is thriving. And again, what a beautiful location. So I am going to talk about...
closer to the microphone because they're having difficulty hearing.
Okay. So I am going to talk about a different line of research than my main research focus, because I thought it might be a little bit fun to talk about some of the lessons I learned along the way and just plunging in to a research field that I really knew nothing about, and it didn't stop me from pursuing nonetheless. So what I'm going to be talking about is what do we learn about a person when we look at their face. And we know that the face does provide all kinds of information. So it tells us about the health status of a person, it can give information about gender, it can tell us about the age of an individual, tells us all kinds of emotional information, whether you're sad, whether you're happy, whether you're disgusted, and all kinds of fear expressions. So we already know, it's long been known, that the face conveys much information. There's also evidence, though, that we make snap judgments about people when we look at them. And the basis for these snap judgments is a matter of debate. So I'm going to be talking about two main questions. First of all, what are the cues in the face that observers make when they're trying to determine the personality or traits of an individual? And related to that, an important point is how consistent are those judgments? So for example, we all may make first impressions, but are my first impression of someone the same as your first impression, and so on? So how consistent are these judgments that we make about an individual? The other question, and this is a Mac PC thing. On a Mac, it says 1, 2. On my PC, it's 1 and 1. I don't know why, but anyways, that should say 2. Are the cues in the face accurate? Now we know that there's accuracy for things like gender, not perfectly, but you can generally tell with a certain degree of accuracy whether someone is male or female. There's other cues in the face that are less accurate. So for example, we make judgments about faces on the basis of whether they look baby-faced or not. And those judgments aren't so accurate. So for example, we know people that look more baby-faced are more likely to be judged as innocent by a jury. And so whether they are or not. The other thing to consider is that if these cues may be predictive, so you may be actually to make accurate you may be actually able to make predictions, but the accuracy of the predictions may be a matter of debate. So to try and make that clear, what I'm talking about is examples of studies that got quite a lot of press, you may have heard about, is how if you take pictures of politicians and ask people which one was the most competent, then it turns out the one that was rated as most competent was the one that won the election. So to try that out here, let me figure you're probably not all familiar with Canadian politicians. So if you look at these 4 characters at the bottom, try and think of which one looks most competent, and we'll see if that's the one that won the election. So to kind of narrow it down, here's 2 of the candidates. And if you picked this guy here, that's Prime Minister Harper, and he actually won the, well, he's right now our Prime Minister. Now the thing is, though, is if you rated him as more competent, and that would have predicted the results of the election, we really don't know if he won because he really is competent. We know that other things go along with competency, like for example, attractive people tend to be rated as more competent and go far on their looks alone, despite there any real evidence that attractive people are more competent. Another thing that can account for these kinds of effects are mere exposure. So for example, the more familiar a face is we tend to like it better. So there's other things that can come into play in terms of trying to determine how accurate are these competencies. So this is just some background to that. Oh, the last thing I wanted to mention as well is that when we find these kinds of associations, it's often difficult to determine the causality. So, for example, if you do find that someone who was rated as more competent is more competent, was it because he was always treated as competent and then kind of learned to rise to the occasion, right? So to know the direction of the relationship in these data that are largely correlational, it's hard to determine. We do know, though, there is some evidence that there is some accuracy for certain face judgments and behavior. So for example, there's been evidence that if you ask women to rate the faces of men in terms of the likelihood that these men like children, that their women's ratings are positively correlated to a certain degree, not perfectly of course, with men's actual interest in infants. Other studies have shown that you have people rate the masculinity or dominance of men's faces. It actually predicts their grip strength. So there's something to do about strength in that. Another set of studies by Sell and colleagues had people rate faces in terms of how tough the faces look, and it predicted upper body strength and the number of fights the individuals had been in. And this is just an example of how they had done that study. So they rated either the faces or the upper body strength, and they did the same study in a couple of different cultures. And what you can see highlighted down here is that there was a pretty strong correlation between the ratings and the actual strength of the men, and the relationship was not as strong in women. So there is all of this evidence that we're making these judgments, and the judgments can have some accuracy, but the cues used to make these judgments really aren't well understood. So how did I become interested in this line of research, which is very far afield from anything I had ever done? Well, being, a science-y type of nerd, one of the things I do when driving in the car is I listen to CBC radio, and we have a science program. Probably you have it on something similar on National Public Radio, Science Fridays, that I'm sure you all tune into. Well, on CBC radio, they talk about different research that's going on, and the day that I happened to be listening, they were interviewing Eleanor Weston. And Eleanor Weston is an anthropologist in Britain, and she had been describing her research that she's conducted on a series of skulls. So she had made all kinds of morphometric measurements on these skulls. And in so doing this complex mathematical analyses of all of this morphometry, she discovered a new metric in the skulls that was different for men and women. So it's a new sexual dimorphism, and she labeled it the width-to-height ratio, and it's literally the distance between these bones divided by the difference between these bones. Now, what captured my interest was the fact that this sexual dimorphism was independent of other sexual dimorphisms in the face, meaning that any other sex difference between men and women's faces is typically highly correlated with body size. So the fact that men tend to have bigger bodies, well, their faces differ based on size alone. So you have these allometric differences. Well, this sex difference is not related to body size. So to me, that tweaked my interest. The other thing that tweaked my interest was that this sexual dimorphism only appears at puberty in skulls. So again, it's appearing in puberty coincident with the rise of testosterone, and that is speculated to be the basis for the dimorphism. So for me, right away, was interested as, well, why would the face have this kind of a trait? So now Weston, when I got hold of her paper after hearing her talk about it on the radio, had a picture trying to illustrate what it would look like in the face. But remember, she had done all of her analyses in skulls. So the first thing that we wanted to do is to see, well, could we measure this just in photographs of people so that, because we wouldn't have access so readily to their skulls. So anyway, so that's the first thing we did, took a bunch of pictures of undergraduate students who actually happened to be at Quinnipiac College, which is just across the border from us in southern Ontario. And my graduate student at the time had been an undergrad at Quinnipiac College, so he was routinely going over there to increase his subject pool. And yes, we found that we could get a sexual dimorphism, facial width-to-height ratio, from photographs. So the next thing we did is, because Justin at the time was interested in the relationship between testosterone aggression, we decided to look at whether the face ratio was correlated with behavioral aggression in men and women undergraduates that we looked at. And we chose aggression partly because it's a sexually dimorphic behavior as well, that men, especially when it comes to physical or reactive aggression, do get higher ratings of aggressiveness than women. It's also considered to be an adaptive behavior and in its relationship with dominant behavior, but it's also because it's adaptive to be able to recognize aggressive potential in others. So for example, this is my former graduate student, Justin Carre. You can see he might look somewhat approachable when he's posed in a neutral expression, but when he looks like this, you just really want to stay away. So again, that's part of the reason why we went after aggression. So we have this measure of behavioral aggression, and I can tell you about it more if you're interested later. But at this point in time, just trust me that it is a highly validated measure of behavioral aggression, and it's nicely administered in a lab setting. And the key thing to know is that it involves 3 button presses on a computer game. Button 2 presses, which are steel presses, are the measure of aggression. And you can see here that if you look at the other button presses, there's no sex difference, but on this game, men show more aggressive responses than that of women. And we have on occasion filmed these men and women playing this game, and if you have any doubt of that it's an aggressive game, by the swearing that goes on when they're on their own in the room and the comments they make, we know there's a lot of aggression going on while they're playing this game. All right, so the first thing we did is we had these people from Canisius College, we had their faces, they had gone through Justin's study. We wanted to see simply was there a correlation. We found that in these college men, but not women, there was a relationship. So we thought that was pretty amazing that we could take out a ruler, pretty much do this simple measurement, and get a correlation with aggressive behavior in the lab. So right away, we sent it quickly to be rejected from psych science. So clearly we thought it was amazing, our colleagues were not so convinced. But in the meantime, Justin had this, what I think was a brilliant idea. Now, Justin's Canadian and he's actually French-Canadian, so of course, he's a hockey player. And Justin, on the meantime, while we were in the few days it took psych science to say no to us, he had gone on the Brock University website where all the hockey players have their pictures and simply thought of saying, you know what, I'm going to look at how the face ratio correlates with aggression outside of a lab setting, and he used penalty minutes because unlike maybe European hockey, hockey in Canada is pretty aggressive game. So when he did that and took the Brock hockey players' measurements and correlated with the penalty minutes per game, again, we got this correlation. So again, we were amazed and we thought just how wonderful that was, and we quickly got rejected from Nature because that time we were really aiming high. So then Justin said, well, you know what? He went and he looked at the Ottawa Senators and he found the relationship there. And I said, well, Justin, you know what? Why the Ottawa Senators? Of all the hockey teams in the world, you can't just look at the Ottawa Senators. People are going to say you just pick the Ottawa Senators by random. Nobody thinks of the Ottawa Senators when you think of hockey. So I said, no, but you don't want to measure the whole NHL. Why don't you look at all the Canadian teams? So he did that. And he found in every team that he looked at, all 6 teams, there was a positive association between the facial width to height ratio and their penalty minutes per game in that season. And this is just an example of 2 hockey players. I believe this was the Toronto Maple Leafs at that time, and you can see the relationship was there. And when we aggregate the data, clearly the relationship was significant. And we managed to get it published finally in the Proceedings of the Royal Society. Now, I've always been a little suspicious of us getting it published because I have to say the editor we were dealing with at that time was a professor at University of Toronto who I did not know, but I'm thinking, yeah, like a Canadian editor is going to love the hockey angle. So clearly we finally got it published. All right. So we didn't stop there because then we thought our idea was that if there is this relationship, now it could be that we've just tapped into some indicator of strength and aggressiveness, but I wanted to think that if this was actually signaling something to observers, if it was acting like an honest signal, then observers should be picking up on this signal and perhaps utilizing it in some way. So our observers' judgments of aggressive behavior correlated with the face ratio became our next set of questions. Now we know that there are such honest signals in other species. So other species are known to advertise how aggressive they are, and it does regulate social relationships. So for example, here in these wasps, this nose type region advertises how aggressive they are. Not at all aggressive, highly aggressive. And researchers have manipulated these face markings and had these wasps compete or defend food sources. And it turns out that other wasps will go try and beat up this guy who doesn't look aggressive to get the food source, and they'll stay away from this guy who looks aggressive. So we know that these kinds of phenomenon exist in other species, and that's what we were trying to go after in people as well. At this point, we actually brought in my colleague Kathy Monbach at Brock University, who is a face perception expert, and she really helped a lot in getting us to design these studies to the standards of face perception people. So what we did is we had people simply look at faces and say, how aggressive do you think this person would be if provoked? And they rated the faces on a 7-point Likert scale. So people looked at pictures for either 2 seconds or, in some of the studies, only 39 milliseconds. When you flash a face for 39 milliseconds, you have to urge the participants to make a rating, because they will say, I don't know, I didn't really see it. And so you have to say, no, go ahead, just make a guess, just make a guess. So what we would do, present the face for 2 seconds or 39 milliseconds. They were given unlimited time to make a rating. Then the next face pops up, they see it, and they simply go through our faces and they make these judgments about the aggressive potential. The first thing I want to show you is that how consistent ratings are, whether you've only seen the face for 39 milliseconds or for 2 seconds. So you can see that even if people think they're just guessing, their judgments are highly correlated with the judgments that people make with 2 seconds. And in fact, across all of our studies, our Combax alpha, the measure of reliability of these ratings, is always very, very high, well over 0.9. And here, what I'm showing you is that the estimates of aggression that observers make were correlated with the face ratio. And this here would be, imagine that I had all of you guys make judgments, and I took your mean judgment of aggression, and then I plotted against with the height ratio. So that's the aggregated data. But imagine, what I'm going to show you next is, imagine I take any one of you and I look at the correlation that you have between your judgments and my face ratios. And then I do it for every person in the room, and just to see, is the correlation in your judgments, is the correlation in your judgments, and so on. So this next slide, to read this is the size of the correlation in participant 1, participant 2, participant 3, and so on. The black bars are men, the white bars are women. So there's no sex difference in the ratings that men make compared to women make. And what I want you to see is how, except for this person here, it's always positively correlated. And that line I've just put up here, it denotes when within an individual the correlation is significant for a set of 24 faces. And you can see that for 77% of the observers, their judgments, the judgment of the individual, is correlated with the height ratio. All right, so again, what we then did is to say, though, well, is it really the face ratio, or is it maybe something else about the face that is correlated with the face ratio? And we've approached this many different ways, sometimes statistically, so on. So I'm just picking out a few of the different approaches that we've taken. In this study, what we did is we tried to get rid of some other cues in the face. So this would be an original face. We cut off the jawline, which also is an index of masculinity, and the forehead, but we've maintained the face ratio. Here we've cropped off even more of the face, but we've maintained the face ratio in terms of at least the size of the box around the face. In face perception, studies have shown that if you blur the face to this extent, it markedly impedes the ability to identify the individual. So this blurs enough of the featural features to impair identity judgments. But again, you can still see the face ratio. Here we have all the individual features, but you'd be hard-pressed to calculate a face ratio from them. So we had people do the same kind of thing, make these judgments, but they'd see faces in this format. So again, in the first three, you're able to see a face ratio. And again, no one's consciously seen a face ratio because most people have never even heard of this face ratio. But nonetheless, the correlations were there in each of these three instances, but no single feature was correlated with judgments of aggression. And this is just an example of what the data looks like in the blurred condition or in the scrambled condition. The other thing we did is to see whether other cues in the face were as predictive of the face ratio of people's judgments of aggression. And to do this, we relied on a computer program that is used quite a bit by face perception people called FaceGen. And what it does, it allows you to load up your pictures into the program, and it generates a computer model of this face, and you can see how similar they look. And they have a standard set of faces that or the average face against which they do all these measurements of the faces. So they allowed us to calculate 61 characteristics in the face. And yes, a few of them were correlated with estimates of aggression, but even when we in a regression model controlling for any of these other features, the face ratio remained a unique predictor and a significant predictor. So again, not to give you all the details of this, but it seems that the face ratio is telling us something different than any of these other measures, even controlling for these other measures. The other thing we wanted to do is to see, well, if there's other people are studying the face all the time, could we use their faces and test some of our relationships? So Todorov is a face perception expert, and he has a lot of faces readily available on his website. And what he has done is he has 25 individual identities. Somebody's aggressive up there. Where's my ruler? So we were able to go in and take his 25 face identities, and what they had done is take 25 different faces and simply get them to each face to vary along a dimension of how threatening they look. So this version of the face was highly threatening, this version of the face was not threatening at all. So we just grabbed all of their faces and simply measured the facial width to height ratio in this database that he had constructed with giving no thought to the face ratio at all. And what we found is when we took his faces that were less threatening to highly threatening, and plotted their mean values, you can see that what Todorov had done in manipulating faces was actually change the face ratio, and so his threatening faces had a higher ratio, his non-threatening faces had a smaller ratio. And just to show you that if we look at each of those individual identities, and look at the lowest threatening face, the medium threatening face, and the highest threatening face. So for one of the identities, you can see the relationship is there. Well, it's there in every single face identity that Todorov had constructed. Okay. So we were really thrilled with that, because this is someone who had made this data set of faces without regard to the face ratio, and it inadvertently supplied us evidence of the importance of the face ratio in judgments of threatening, which to us is very similar to aggression. Now, of course, we had been dealing only with Caucasian faces at this point, and we wanted to see if this relationship existed in other ethnicities, because our idea is if this is an adaptive trait, that if it had something that had undergone some kind of selection pressure, well, we should find it throughout time and throughout cultures. So that said, though, there's a lot of evidence in face perception research that there are own race advantages or race biases reported for other face judgments, meaning that it's easier to recognize and identify someone from your own race than it is from another race or ethnicity. Same for age, same for when judging emotion, and for other aspects of face processing. So we were predicting something universal, but we were well aware of that there are that you do develop some expertise at processing faces that you're most familiar with, which tend to be faces of your own ethnicity. So to do this, we had to rely on the help of Kang Lee, who's at University of Toronto, another face perception expert who had provided us with some Chinese faces and also put us in contact with collaborators of his in China. And so now we had our set of male Caucasian faces, a set of Chinese faces. We had our participants at Brock, and we had participants in China. Again, same thing we always had been doing, just have people rate aggression. For Caucasian observers, what we found was that the relationship was there between their estimates of aggression and the face ratio. Sorry, just changed the axes on you. And same thing for Chinese faces as well. So it didn't matter which ethnic group they were making ratings about, the relationship was there. In China, one of our graduate students at Brock actually went over, and she said that she thought she was the only Caucasian in a 100-mile radius of the university. So again, we were dealing with Chinese participants with little familiarity at all with Caucasian faces. And for these Chinese observers, the relationship was there when they were looking at Caucasian faces. The relationship was there when they were looking at Chinese faces. And here, just to show you the data plotted for the individual observers. So for the most part, the correlations are positive and significant. We also looked at, do children, are they sensitive to this cue in some way in making judgments? Now keep in mind we were studying 8-year-olds, were now our observers. And we chose 8-year-olds because actually Kathy Mondlock is, again, she studies the development of face perception, and her research has shown that children's face processing abilities with regard to facial identity develops, is not fully developed at 8 years of age, but is developed by about 13, 14 years of age. So we know at 8 years of age they're not face processing experts, but keep in mind that there's different systems for processing of emotion versus identity and so on. So we were thinking, well, maybe they won't be experts at it, but the relationship may be there in children, because I'm sure it's probably adaptive for children to be able to recognize aggressive potential in others. So it was again the same kind of study, same faces. The only thing that differed is that we wanted to make sure the children were understanding the task, and so we used how mean do you think this person would be as well. So we used a few more adjectives, and we just had them point to different cup sizes as in indicators of not at all mean or aggressive or highly mean and aggressive. And the relationship was there in Caucasian children, whether they were looking at the Caucasian faces or the Chinese faces. Same thing for the Chinese observers, but you can see they aren't as good at it as the adults, or at least the correlations were not statistically significantly lower, but they were lower and more individual differences. So just to summarize those studies, the face ratio does seem to be associated with the estimates of aggression in both ethnic groups and for both ethnic groups. And the 8-year-old data shows that face expertise is not necessary to infer aggressive potential from these neutrally posed faces. Okay. Nevertheless, children were somewhat less accurate than were adults. So the last thing I'm going to show you with this is that we finally then got around to looking at women's faces, because keep in mind we had dropped women very early on because we hadn't found a relationship between the face ratio and their aggressive behavior on our task in the lab, and we hadn't found in the Brock women's hockey team any relationship between the women's faces and their penalty minutes. So that's why we focused on men's faces. But then, you know, we thought that, well, there may not be an accurate cue, or we have no evidence that it's an accurate cue yet in women, but maybe observers are still using that cue, or at least their judgments would be correlated with this facial measure. And that if you look at the correlations of individual observers, the correlations tend to be higher for men's faces than women's faces, but here the aggregate correlations, even though this predicts far less of the variance than does this correlation for men and this one for women, you can still see that both are significant correlations. So So it looks that even though we have no evidence to suggest it's an accurate cue in women that people are using, the face ratio does seem to be a basis of the judgments of aggressive potential. So something else, though, interesting came up when we did these studies. Now, what I've only been telling you is that about our judgments of aggression and the face ratio, but we also had them do other judgments in all of our studies, like attractiveness and masculinity, femininity, and so on. And I didn't show you all those data, but we have controlled for ratings of attractiveness as masculinity, femininity, and even when we do control for those things statistically in our analyses, the face ratio still remains a significant predictor. So we have done all of that, but when we started to look at the patterns of correlations, what we thought was interesting was popping out. Now, you'd expect that masculinity should be just the inverse of femininity, right? That if someone was rated really masculine, well, they're probably going to be rated as not very feminine. We know that nurturing is a stereotypically female trait, feminine trait, and we know aggression is a stereotypically male trait. So we'd expect these two to be negatively correlated. We'd expect nurturing to be negatively correlated with masculinity, femininity to be negatively correlated with aggression, positively correlated with nurturing. And hopefully my color scheme worked here. So the first correlation I'll show you is for men, the second one here for women. And things are coming up just as you'd expect. These things should be negatively correlated. These two behavioral stereotypic traits should be negatively correlated. Masculinity and nurturing, negatively correlated in both men and women's faces. Femininity, positive in both. And in men, masculinity and aggression, femininity and aggression, all coming out the right way, or as we would expect. But when it came to aggression and masculinity in female faces, it was the correlations were significant, and they weren't significant for femininity. And so we don't have this all worked out, but this is, to me, this was another just little interesting thing that came along, is that even though all these sex-related traits seem to fit together in a consistent way in men, they aren't fitting together in a consistent way in women. And so it looks like our judgments of aggression are not really based on masculinity and femininity judgments in the same way. So I came up, since my big forte is either coming up with cheesy acronyms or cheesy titles, this was the title that I wanted for the paper, is Judging Aggression in Female Faces is Less Gendered and Less Rational. You won't see it ever in that state because my colleague said no way. So anyways, but that's kind of my conclusion on this at this point. But again, I think it's pointing out something that we would like to pursue, and raises other possibilities as to are there other types of aggression that we should be considering for women, or what are we using when we're making judgments of women, why isn't it tied to femininity and masculinity in the same way? So some of my conclusions then is that the face ratio we're gathering evidence that it's an honest signal of aggressive potential, and we're continuing to do studies now to see how do social relationships, are they affected in some way by these judgments. So now we're trying to see, well, how does face ratio in an individual making the judgment, does that moderate any of the relationships, and trying to get a better handle on some of the individual differences. One of the things that we think is going on, though, is that this may be some overgeneralization of emotional expressions. Keep in mind, Justin here, in his neutral state, and when he makes an angry face, one of the things that he's doing is shortening that distance, thereby increasing his face ratio. So we think one of the bases for why a wider width to height ratio does signal aggressive potential is because it's capitalizing on the angry facial expression. Oh, and just to show how Justin then became the poster boy for Brock University, I'm at a cheesy university that has our both sides of the brain, you know, which right and left side. So we have Justin now as one of the Brock University poster boys. So that was another little fallout from all of this. So trusting first impressions, well, the thing that we've also been happy to see is that there have been a few papers that have also looked at the face ratio. And what they have found actually is that it's negatively correlated with actual trustworthy behavior and negatively correlated with judgments of trustworthiness. Now, you think, well, why trustworthiness? And you guys are looking at aggression, but we already have evidence that trustworthiness is actually the opposite side of the coin of aggression ratings. If you ask people to make judgments of aggression and of trustworthiness, they're highly negatively correlated. So again, we think that it's supportive evidence of the face ratio signaling stuff. And so the last thing is, should you judge a book by its cover? Well, no, because I've shown you the relationships are there, but you'd be hard-pressed to predict something about an individual on this basis, but maybe you could judge a bookstore by its covers. And I was going to put up an adult bookshop versus the university one, but I thought, all right, I won't push that one too much. And then the last thing I wanted to say is because, you know, in giving this talk, why I chose specifically this sideline was to try and have something to actually say to you about being young researchers in neuroscience, and just to urge you to explore new directions. And that one of the things that you have obtained by having a great undergraduate education is you've been exposed to courses of many different types. And so when things will tweak your interests that may not be on your mainstream plan, but go ahead and explore these new directions, because it can take you in unexpected ways and have you learn things. And to me, that's what's been most fun about a career in science is, you know, like I said the other day, is, ooh, shiny new object, I get to follow that. Ooh, shiny new object, you know, so you can always be interested in new questions. And I think it keeps research exciting. The other thing I hope I've shown you is don't give up. You can get rejected by journal after journal, and you know what? Stick with it. Don't give up just because you don't get published in Nature. Anyways, still have. The other thing I wanted to say is find great collaborators. And Cheryl mentioned how we've been long-standing collaborators, and she's been a great source of help for me through my career in my main line of research. And I've been so fortunate to have great students like Justin, who's now in his first year as an assistant professor at Wayne State, and my colleague Kathy Monblock at Brock, and our other that. So when you find great collaborators that are great friends as well, that also makes it fun. So thank you so much for listening to me. Thank you for NSERC and SSHRC in Canada for helping fund this research, the other people, students and that in the lab that have been involved, as well as my other collaborators. And it's been a thrill to be here and see the Neuron thrive.